Hi again. In today's lesson, we're going to complete our understanding of harmony. Just going to kind of hit a few spots that haven't been covered yet. The most important chord we're going to be covering is the submediate chord, meaning the sixth chord. But we're also going to talk, we're going to revisit the four chord, and we're also going to talk very briefly about the three chord, but mostly we're going to spend our time on the sixth chord because that's really the most important one in terms of kind of your typical phrases that you're going to be encountering. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the submediate chord. This is actually a very interesting chord. So if this is your main key, here's the sixth chord. If you're in a minor key, here's the sixth chord. Okay, now this chord is kind of interesting because as mentioned here, it has two common tones with both the tonic chord, so it has scale degree 1 and 3, but it also has two common tones with the four chord, so it has 4 and 6 as well. This makes it a very ambiguous chord. It's going to be kind of somewhere in between tonic and predominant, whereas oftentimes never being one exactly, kind of somewhere in between. So let's talk about three uses of the sixth chord, and they kind of follow from this idea. Now, first use, I don't know, perhaps this is the most common one I'd say that you encounter, would be to find 6 as a bridge between the tonic chord and the beginning of predominant function. So basically, it'll be the first chord that occurs after the tonic, but because it has all those common tones with the tonic, it won't sound like a substantial move away from it. But then you'll move on to something more substantial predominant chord. So the two progressions that you might encounter would be 1, 6 to 4. So go on from 6 to 4. That would be roots by descending thirds. So 1, 6, 4. Or you could go, of course, to an even stronger predominant. 2 is a stronger predominant than 4. And in this case, kind of moving by starting descending fifths. This is what I associate a little more with jazz, but you can also, of course, use the 2-6 chord, which would have the same scale degree 4 in the bass. So 1, 6. Sorry, hard to play this. 2. So you might get the 2, 5, 1 bass, so kind of 6, 2, 5, 1, kind of a jazz leaping descending fifth bass. All right, so this first example that I have here is an example of the sixth chord being used in this way. It's basically a bridge in between the tonic and the predominant. So I put 6 underneath the tonic line. I mean, it does have all those common tones, but it's sort of in between. It's really not tonic or predominant. Now, notice this one, by the way, is an example of what is called an embedded phrase model, in that this tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progression actually prolongs the tonic at the next level, because after that, you get the real predominant, you get another 2, 6, and then the cadence. Let me play this one for you, but nevertheless, just notice how 6 goes on to 2. 6, 2, 5, and then to 1. Let me play it again without talking. And then we get the true predominant, and we get the half cadence. Anyhow, this will be a very, very common situation. Notice at the bass at the very beginning, D, B, G, moving down by thirds. That kind of descending thirds bass is a common thing you encounter with 6 used like this. All right, so and nothing special from a voice leading standpoint. Just, follow your basic voice leading guidelines. Nothing special to know about here. Now, a second use of the sixth chord is to use it as a predominant chord. That is to go straight into the 5. Now, it's kind of an awkward thing, and it's actually extremely rare, Really, this would work a lot better if you had the minor key 6th chord, but in that case, you end up having these voice leading problems. So later on, we'll encounter a chromatic chord that composers like to use instead of this. Now, if 6 goes straight to 5, the thing that's so weird about it is the voice leading. You have to move the upper voices, since the bass is going to go down, La to Sol, like right here, La to Sol. The upper voices will have to move in contrary motion to the bass, otherwise you're going to get parallels. So you get the very, very strange voice leading where the bass goes down by step and all the upper voices move up by step. Or up to the nearest chord tone. I'm going to play the last 4 measures of this. And there might even be some disagreement about whether this is an actual predominant. So tonic, and this is some sort of secondary chord here. 6, and then 5. So you get this strange progression here. 6, sounds okay as a predominant, but that wedge-like voice leading is kind of the opposite of what we usually get from a predominant. Usually a predominant has a rising bass, and then the upper voices go down instead of up. So this is a very kind of uncommon progression, at least in the classical style. So main thing to be careful about if you are given this progression is just make sure that you follow the voice leading guidelines for stepwise progressions, group motions by step. So move upper voices in contrary motion to the bass. All right, let's go on now. Now on to maybe the most famous use of the 6th chord. This is going to be the third and final one we're going to talk about, is to use it as a tonic substitute in what we call the deceptive progression. So 5 going to 6 is one example of what we call a deceptive progression. So instead of 5 going to 1, the bass moves up by step. If you do encounter this, when the 5 resolves deceptively to 6, the music will usually then cycle back to a strong predominant chord. So it's kind of like the 6th chord then goes on and goes to that first use, which is as a bridge between the tonic and the predominant. So the reason this progression is so famous, besides the fact that it's a very interesting effect, is you got to be careful voice leading this one. So here are the rules for resolving 5 to 6. Number 1, do what you always do with the 5 chord, which is resolve your tendency tones. So take the 3rd, or the leading tone, up. And if there is a 7th, if you have a 5-7 chord, take the 7th down. After doing that, move any remaining voices in contrary motion to the bass. This is important because otherwise you're going to get some parallel fifths and parallel octaves. And then you're going to end up with a doubled 3rd in the 6th chord. So notice right here, I'm going in A minor, 5 to 6. I resolved the leading tone up. There was no 7th here, so leading tone went up. Then all the other voices, which there are 2 remaining voices, they move down to the nearest chord tone. And you end up with a doubled 3rd, which luckily enough is scale degree 1, which works actually very nice for this progression. So I have a little abstract example here. Let me play that real quick. So in A minor. Oh, sorry. There's your leading tone, resolve that up. And again, if you had to do that, you kind of expect a strong predominant 5 to 1 to get you back. Now then over here, here's a musical example of this sort of phenomenon. This is in D minor. And you'll notice that in the 3rd measure here, you have a 5-7 going to 6. So there's your deceptive progression. Notice I put the T in parentheses there to show it's a substitute for the tonic. Then it moves on to a stronger predominant, 4 to 4-6, and then to 5. Let me just play the 3rd and 4th measures. So here's our key. And then here, like I said, kind of implied 1-6. Sorry, what am I doing? Then 5-7. Then here's your deceptive progression to 6. So now we have to go to a stronger predominant, 4, 4, 6 to 5. Okay, so there you go. All right, so those are the three uses of the sixth chord, at least the three most common ones. Let's do a little activity now. Question 1. This is going to be your main activity for this handout. I've given you the first phrase of Mozart's Clarinet Quintet, and the Roman numerals are already given to you, but what I want you to do is to provide a second level analysis. Let's see if we can make sense of all what happens here. There's actually a lot of chords. By the way, the P's here mean passing, so that might already give you a little bit of clue of what's going on there. So go ahead and pause the video. Actually, let me first play this for you. I'm going to play you a recording of this. All right, so pause the video now and work on your second level analysis, and I'll show you what I have. All right, let's take a look at my analysis. Now there's actually two deceptive progressions here, but they kind of occur on different levels. The first one, I actually put those first two measures all as just tonic prolongation. To me, that first 5 chord, that little mini dominant to tonic, is a very, very small scale one. If you look at the melody, notice how that really just sounds like the tonic chord being outlined. The bass goes. Right, that one just to me sounds like a kind of very, very small deceptive progression, and definitely not like a cadence point. It's so early. To me, that just sounds like a tonic prolongation. Very nice outer voice contrary motion. Of course, we can't forget the importance of counterpoint. All right, then measure 2, all predominant, and there the 1/6 is acting as a passing chord. Then we get the true, or at least we get the first spot where we could be getting to a cadence. That's when we get the next deceptive progression. It's more substantial than that first one. So I did put the dominant for that 5/7 chord, but then I go to the tonic, but it's in parentheses because we have a deceptive progression. Then, like mentioned, we always, after the deceptive progression, always cycle back to a strong predominant chord. Then we move on to this 4 chord. 1/6 passes in between 1 and 2/7. It's just interesting to see that you can also use the 1 chord as a prolongational chord. Anyway, so along then predominant prolongation, then we get the dominant and the tonic. So there you go. So very interesting example using a couple of deceptive progressions. All right, so now we've covered the main chord I wanted to talk about for this lecture, but let's finish up by just talking about a couple more things, just because even though these things are not going to be encountered as much, it's good for you to know. So first up, other uses of the 4 chord. Meaning up to now, we've only seen the 4 chord really used in one way, which is as a predominant. So up here, the 4 chord acted as a predominant, right? It moved on to the dominant. But the 4 chord is actually kind of special because it's one of the only other chords that is allowed to resolve to the tonic. All right. Now, if the 4 chord does resolve to the tonic, it's going to be a tonic prolongation. And you've kind of seen this before in the neighbor 6/4. If you went 1, 4, 6, 4 to 1, we saw that that's kind of like a tonic prolongation. Same idea here. So 4, if it does go to the tonic, it's going to be part of a tonic prolongation. And I'm talking about here 4 in root position. All right, now a couple things you might see for this. The first example, this is number 2, and then the first one that's notated down here, is when you just go at, let's say, beginning of the example or something like that, you go 1, 4, 1. And you can see how this can still be considered a tonic prolongation. The upper voices produce those neighbors. Notice how the soprano goes sol, la, sol. The alto goes mi, fa, mi. You know, it's very similar to the neighbor 6/4 chord. So let me play that one real quick. Right. So that would definitely sound like a tonic prolongation. Now, then number 3, the other use is the famous plagal cadence, also known as the amen cadence. Now, very important, at least in the classical style, if you do encounter this, it's always going to be after a PAC. So it's really like a tag at the end of a phrase. It's like when the phrase model is already finished, you've already had your dominant to tonic, you're going to tag on the plagal cadence, and you're going to have scale degree 1 in the soprano. That's one of the nice things about the 4 chord, is that it contains scale degree 1. So the amen cadence kind of holds over that scale degree in the soprano. And again, this will be a tonic prolongation. So playing the second one, let's say we had cadence, then I can tag on. All right, notice the happening in the soprano. So that's just another thing to know about from an analysis standpoint. Just because you see a 4 chord, don't assume it's a predominant. It has to behave as a predominant. It has to move on to the 5 chord to be a predominant. But the 4 chord is a little more variable, and it can also be used as a tonic prolongation. Alrighty, so let's now go into our last chord. Now this one is really quite rare. Sorry, where's my... All right, finally, the mediant chord. This is really the only diatonic chord we haven't covered. If you think through all the chords we've talked about all the other ones. We've also talked about which chords tend to have sevenths, such as, 2, 7. Now, the mediant chord is the one that you're really going to encounter it's very uncommon in the style, mainly because the function, just if you think about the pitch content of it, it's kind of ambiguous. And also there's major differences between whether you encounter this in a minor key or a major key. Very, very different, we're going to find out. Now, number 2, if it's in a major key, like this first example, it usually appears in place of the 1/6 chord. You'll recall that the 1/6 chord has scale degree 3 in the bass. Usually if you have scale degree 3 in the bass, you're going to assume it's a 1/6. But occasionally you'll find the 3 in place of it. And the only interesting thing there is that it actually produces a very interesting soprano line. It's one case where the soprano might have scale degree 7, but it doesn't have to resolve up. Since the 3 chord doesn't have dominant function, the scale degree 7 can move down, and you get this nice little wedge between the outer voices. Notice how the bass goes do, mi, fa, and the soprano goes do, ti, la. Let me play this for you. And then you might go back onto the 5. Now, probably, if you heard that, you probably thought it sounds kind of sounds out of the classical style, doesn't it? It's something you find more in popular music. Now, a completely different phenomenon is the 3 chord in a minor key. That's because the 3 chord in a minor key is also the same chord that's the tonic of the relative major. So, for example, in C minor, like I have in the second one, the 3 chord is an E flat major chord, which is the tonic of the relative major. So it ends up sounding very stable for that reason. So it's just like kind of the exact opposite from the 3 in a major key. Now, a lot of times you'll find this 3 chord preceded by the diatonic 7. That is where you don't raise the leading tone. You'll notice when I play it, it will often sound like a 5 of 3. Many of you know about the concept of a secondary dominant. And that's sort of what this sounds like. So a lot of times you'll find 7, then 3. Well, what you kind of hear is like 5 of 3 to 3. All right, let's play the second one. So C minor. All right, sounds very stable, doesn't it? And the chord before it really sounded like 5 to 1. Anyhow, the 3 chord, don't expect to encounter it too much, but it's actually a very interesting chord from a theoretical standpoint.